Hi everyone, BritSimon here. I want to talk to you about Nairobi Embassy because there are obviously a lot of people at Nairobi Embassy, a lot of Kenyans and other countrymen that are waiting for interviews at Nairobi. And Nairobi for the last couple of years has been a good, reliable place to be interviewed at. But this year, things could be different. We don't really know. We need to look at the data and try and understand what's going on. Now, let me just say from the outset, let me explain what they've done so far. They took interviews, I believe, in October, November, and December. And in fact, we can see from official issuance data, there were nearly 400 Kenyans issued visas, DV visas, in the month of December. However, they didn't take any interviews in January, February, or March. And so far, although we're not over the month yet, we're not completed with the month yet, but so far, no April interviews have been scheduled for Nairobi that I'm aware of in the month of February, right? So the 2NLs that we see being issued this month, affect the month of April, right? So there is obviously a concern. It seems like they were going very, very well last year, and then all of a sudden they hit a brick wall. And so I want to show you the data and explain from that point of view. But I also want you to understand that we don't really know what's happened in Nairobi, why they decided to have this, the first 3 months of the year were wasted. And they might do the same for April. We don't know yet. We can't make a judgment yet until the end of the month. So if by the way, if you're running around like a headless chicken saying the sky has fallen, there are no interviews in April, you're too early. You can't make that determination yet. They could schedule interviews in April still, and they could schedule those by the end of the month, and that wouldn't be a total surprise to me that they operate that way. But let me show you a few things. I need to show you a little bit of data, so let me share a screen with you. This one. Okay, so we're going to look at a few things here. So if you're interested in Nairobi, you'll want to watch this video. But if you're not interested, go ahead and do something else. That's fine. You don't need to watch if you're not particularly interested in Nairobi. This is only for Nairobi. Okay. Now, first thing you should do is come to the DV25 data, which you can see on Zarthesius' site. You've got all the data there. You can see 25, 24, 23, and so on. We can also see the monthly, annual, and IV issuances by post. That's also useful data. But just the other day, Zarthesius added a feature to this data, which is actually Narek's spreadsheet. Now, Narek, some of you have seen me discuss this before, but basically what Zarthesius has done is he's incorporated the design of Narek's spreadsheet into his data and into his site, so that you can very quickly go into the site and see information for all of the embassies side by side, which personally I find very, very useful indeed. Okay, so here's the data, and this is pulling data directly from Zarthesius's data. So when that data updates, refreshes, this data updates and refreshes, right? So it's up-to-date information. Okay, so if we scroll across until we get to Nairobi, that's Nairobi there, NRB, right? And we can see that per 1,000 case numbers, there is a number of scheduled interviews. These are interviews, cases rather than people, right? So in the first 1,000 cases, Nairobi took 45 interviews out of that first 1,000 case numbers, right? Then 30 in the next 1,000 case numbers, 47 in the next, and so on. And it continued scheduling up until just over 11,000. I say just over 11,000 because this drop to 8 means that there's only a partial, partial piece of that 30 of that 1,000 between 11,000 and 12,000. So their latest case number is just over 11,000 in terms of the scheduling, and this is what they scheduled up until December. Okay, so ignore this 8. and look at the numbers here. And if you just highlight them in the spreadsheet, down here you can see the average. So it's given you very nicely an average of 37.45. You can probably just about see that, but we'll call that 37.5, right? So what that means is that on average, per 1,000 cases, Nairobi takes 37.5 cases, right? Now those will be Kenyans and non-Kenyans, anybody that is assigned to the embassy, okay, in Nairobi. So first thing we understand is how many cases per 1,000 they get. 37.5 is the number. And then we start thinking about, okay, are they backlogged? How backlogged are they? Well, if up till last month, they should have taken cases up to 25,000, right? So if they got all the way to 11,000, we'll just cut it off at 11,000. We'll ignore those 8 cases just above 11,000. If they were if they had gone all the way to 25, they would have had 14,000 separate buckets more of 37.5 cases, right? So if we multiply that number for a start, that gives us 525 cases. And essentially what that means is that is the backlog as of last month's visa bulletin. The new visa bulletin has moved to 30,000, so that I'll come to in a minute. But until this month, their backlog from previous months, that's the backlog from January, February, March, effectively, is 525 cases, right? Now, the new visa bulletin was released and it added another 5,000 case numbers. So now there should be, let's say, 19 times 37.5. That's 712. We'll call it 700, right? Call it 700 cases that if Nairobi wanted to catch up with all of their backlog today and issue appointments for April, they would have to take about 700 cases to wipe out that backlog in 1 month, right? That's what this means, right? And we can predict that based on the number of cases they get per 1,000, which we know will be pretty much an average of 37.5. It's an average, it's not precise, but it's an average. And they're 19,000 behind the visa bulletin for April. And so 19 times 37.5 gives us those 700 cases to catch up, right? Now, do they need to catch up in 1 month? No, they don't need to do that, right? So let's say they had just for round numbers. Let's say they made 375 cases available. That means that they would move from 11,000 to 21,000, right? Let's say that's because they had made a capacity available for 375 interviews to take place in the month of April. Okay, they would still have a backlog, and in fact, they would have cut down some of that backlog, but they'd take 375 of those cases out of the 700, right? And so that would be one way to reduce the backlog, and maybe over 2 or 3 months they catch up the backlog, right? Now, now we know the backlog, we know the average number of cases. We need to think about whether Nairobi has done this before and whether they've had a backlog like this before and what has been their behavior when that happened, right? And so for that, we need to look at previous year's data. So let's just come back to this later. We'll put all this information down. And we can look at Nairobi for each given year. First of all, we look at 25, and I'll show you confirmation of what they've done so far. 421 scheduled cases up until December, right? And you can see here's the 11,000. This is the between 10,000 and 12,000, and they have, I think it's one case at 14,000 or so, 14,000-ish. But that case is a transfer back into Nairobi from another embassy, so we don't consider that one. Okay, so we can see where they are in terms of the data. I've got this data right up to date, and you can see the cases that they scheduled that they have in transit there. Hang on a second. In transit? No, we don't have cases in transit. That's general in transit. That's the region. But you can see what they have from the shape of the data there. Let's have a look at 24, and there's some interesting stuff to show you in 24. So this is DV24. This is last year. Let's just look at Nairobi. Okay, and if we look at this performance, we see some things. So first of all, instead of the 420 cases that we started the year with showing the scheduling from the earliest part of the month, that's the 1/1, the January 1st extract. That's the first time we get the data. The data's there before, but we don't get the data until January 1, right? Last year in DV24, they had 892 cases were scheduled. That compares with 421 this year in DV25. Then, as you can see, they scheduled 100 cases, 200 cases, and so on in January, February, March or so. And then they increased their capacity. So in April, which would have been for June interviews, they took 339 cases, and they took in May 372 cases, and then for the month of September interviews, both these amounts, the 218 and the 217, so nearly 440 cases, actually 435 cases, they took 435 for the month of September. Okay. This June scheduling would have been for August, 345, but they took 435 for the month of September. So that's pretty good. Now, 435 is in DV24 was their maximum capacity. So we're not talking about an embassy that can only see 50, 60 people. We're talking about an embassy that in DV24 took 435 cases in 1 month, right? Now, the other thing I want you to look at here, if I just move the time slider in DV24 back to, let's say, February. Okay. Now, in February, you can see that Africa as a whole had cases scheduled up to 40,000, right? Now, in February, the visa bulletin for February was released that made cases current up to, I think, 45,000. And then I think it was 52,000 for the following month, right? But so that's Africa as a whole. At that time, when Nairobi was, let's just look at Nairobi for a second. If we look at Nairobi was only scheduling cases up to 34 to 36,000, about 35 and something thousand. So they were already backlogged at that point. At this point last year, they were backlogged by about 10,000 case numbers, right? Now, if we move the time slider bar on a little bit more, that was at the end of March. Sorry, the end of February, rather. That's the beginning of March. If we move that time slider on again to April, which is now just before they scheduled April, May, June, just before they scheduled the June interviews, right? You can see that Africa as a whole had cases scheduled up to 52,000 because that was the current amount for that month at that time period. And Nairobi was still only up to about 38 to 40,000. So it was still backlogged at that point. And that was that exact moment in time was April, the beginning of April, before the April interviews were sent out. So we're talking about before this 339 cases were sent out, right? If I just show you that there, that's just before those 339, right? So what I'm saying is that in DV24, Nairobi was backlogged at this time of year, just as it is this point in this year, right? Now they were scheduling cases, but they weren't scheduling enough to keep up with the demand. So they were backlogged. And then in April, they suddenly started increasing the number of slots available, the capacity. They increased the number of visa slots available. First 339, then the following month 372, then 345, all very good months, and then a huge month in September. And because they did that, by the end of the year, they were not only right up to the current number. Well, I mean, they by the end of the year, actually, they got to 122,000, right? So in other words, they scheduled cases right up to the absolute maximum number. I think they were about the highest case number. So they not only dealt with their backlog, but they also went crazy and they went all the way up to 122,000. And there's only a few embassies that did that. You can actually look at the same data and see how few embassies did that. It was very rare. So Nairobi did an exceptional job of catching up, right? The other thing that is interesting and telling from last year is that you can see this pattern where the number of cases per 2,000 shows here at around about 80 on average, maybe 75 or something. So similar sort of volume of cases up until about case number 74,000, and then it went lower, right? That ties with the reduction in case numbers per thousand that is up here, and what it indicates is that Kenya in DV24 was limited during the draw, so all of its cases were under 74 or 75,000. And then they reached a limit during the draw, and no more Kenyan cases were selected after that point, right? In DV25, we have a similar thing, but I think the limit this year, based on just asking a few people this morning, is somewhere in the upper 60s. It's a little bit below, I think, last year. But there is going to be a limit to the number of, a limited number of selectees. Sorry, there's a high density of selectees from Kenya up to a limited number. And after that point, there won't be any more Kenyans. What that means is, for the Nairobi embassy, we'll have a similar pattern to this. Let's say they somehow, Africa got current this year. I don't believe that's going to happen. But let's say that happened. If it did happen, we would have a similar sort of pattern of the data to this. We would see a cutoff happening and then a lower density of cases in later case numbers, because there are other countries other than Kenya who interview at Nairobi embassy. Now, I think our cutoff, the final cutoff for the final visa bulletin in DV25 is probably going to impact some of those very highest case numbers. I think there is risk for some of those highest case numbers, and I'm not sure we'll ever see this reduction in density that we saw last year, because we just won't go to those high case numbers that would go all the way up to 88,000, right? So we can therefore say that the density, the number of cases per thousand, will continue at about 37.5 cases per thousand, perhaps a little bit more. It might increase from there a little bit, all the way up to, let's say, 60,000, which might be around about the point we start to see some risk for Africa cutting off at that point anyway, right? So so that's another important point. Now, if I look at DV23 data, you can see a similar sort of thing happened. It's not just DV24 where this happened. Nairobi. All right, so we look at that, and we can see again, they tended to sort of, have okay performance. They got to a certain point, 36, 37,000 or so, but they, for some reason, didn't go all the way last year, right? They didn't get to the very end. There was this one sort of bizarre case at 57,000 or so, but that was, again, that was a transfer back in. Nairobi themselves didn't get that. Okay. Now, what that does show is that in DV23, we're looking at 23. In DV23, they didn't get to the end of the numbers, right? They left some people at high case numbers unaccounted for. They didn't schedule those cases. So we've seen behavior from Nairobi in the last 2 years, just looking at DV24 and DV23, that shows a capability of increasing their their numbers to meet the capacity, even when the capacity is extreme, and be one of the front runners. We've seen them come back from backlogs, right? We've seen that behavior, and we have also in DV 2023 seen them say, actually, we can't catch up with all those cases, we can't schedule all those cases, and their capacity has stopped them getting to the end of their caseload. Okay, the capacity, right? And so the capacity is something that we need to worry about, but you have to consider, okay, will they increase the capacity and catch up as they did in 24, or will they behave more like DV23, where they limited the capacity and decided not to do anything about that, right? The reality is we don't know, right? We don't know what they're going to do. If you want my guess on it, I'm kind of an optimistic person. I suspect, I hope that Nairobi is going to give us a pleasant surprise, but the evidence isn't there to say that that's true yet. Okay, we need to see them start to schedule cases. And so what I'm trying to say to you is, look, have a look at the data. You can see the data for yourself. You can see the information from previous years yourself. You can figure out how they behaved before, and that might give you some comfort that they could decide to catch up if they wanted to. They absolutely could. They could get all the way caught up within 2 or 3 months. It wouldn't be a problem at all. They have the capacity to do that. Will they do that? I don't know, right? That's because we're not privy to the internal discussions that they're having to say, you know, what they're prioritizing at the moment. Somebody did suggest this morning, and I think it's possible, that they may have decided to spend some time focusing on the immediate relative cases to bring down the backlog of those IR cases. But how long will they spend on doing that work rather than doing the DV lottery work, right? We don't know. There's possibilities that they could be impacted by staff reduction, which could happen this year. That could be a factor. There is almost no possibility, by the way, that the change of ambassador made any difference to the embassy. That's not the reason. Changing ambassadors doesn't stop the embassy themselves performing in a normal way. And so that's not the reason that this lack of scheduling happened, right? So please stop passing that rumor on. That's not a true one. But my great hope would be that Nairobi would get back in the game and would start scheduling interviews and really add to the number of cases being scheduled in Africa. If they do that, then Africa is on for a very successful year in terms of the number of cases scheduled. They might even reach their quota for the first time in many years. But a lot of that does depend on Nairobi, the behavior of Nairobi embassy. So we have to see how that works. We, of course, need to consider that we now have an anti-immigration government administration under Trump. There are going to be impacts from that. There's no doubt. I just don't know exactly whether they will impact Nairobi or not. We'll have to wait and see, what happens. Okay, I'm hoping that's given you enough information to either feel some comfort or say, actually, I'm more worried that they're going to do something like DV23. Now, based with that information, when you've got that information and you understand the information, and you can go and look at the information I've just presented and see if you agree with me, see if I've made some sort of mistake or whatever in my logic. But you then have to make a decision whether you want to stay at Nairobi embassy, stay associated with that embassy and wait for them to interview you, or whether you want to try and transfer. If you want to transfer, the most successful way to transfer is to change your address. In other words, move to another country before you get current. Once you get current, once your case number is current, it's much harder to do that, because KCC won't unlock your case, right? And KCC's perspective, their attitude is, if you get locked into a non-performing embassy, they don't care. That is not a justification for you to move your case, right? If you get locked in. So if you've moved to another country before you get current, then that other country can be used for your scheduling, and that might be one way that some of you want to handle your cases. But once you become current, it's much harder to achieve that movement. Okay, it is possible to ask for an embassy or ask for an embassy change based on your physical presence. That is possible, but KCC are not tremendously cooperative with those sort of requests in all cases. So you have to be aware of that. Okay. All right. That was really what I wanted to explain. I'm hoping that's interesting and useful to some of you. And you can now make your own decisions about how you want to handle your case armed with the information that I've given you. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye now.